Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of His Her's Take, where we discuss everything sports. My name is Elizabeth Aburto, and I'm joined by my two fellow co-hosts.
My name is Nieya Smith.
And I'm Justin Cole.
Today, our topic is mental health in sports, but more specifically, how the pressure to perform can impact the mental health of both college and professional athletes. But before we begin, Nieya will share with us what is mental health.
Mental health is defined by the World Health Organization, which is the state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities and can cope with the normal stresses of life. They can work productively and fruitfully, and also they are able to make a contribution to his or her community. Mental Health Awareness Month is in May, and just some examples of mental illnesses include depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and addictive behaviors.
Thank you. Now let's get started. I had the pleasure of speaking with Andrew Joy, the founder of TMD, a company that specializes in sports psychology training and counseling services. A brief background on Mr. Joy. He'd been a hockey player his whole life, from house league to minor league, played in college, went to grad school at BU Medical, has a master's in mental health counseling and sports psych, moved back to Chicago, and it was here he started his company after working with the Blackhawks for the 2014 and 15th season. He explained to me that he'd always had a passion for it, and he knew he wanted to study up on it, and being an athlete himself, he could relate to it. When asked how likely it was for an athlete to seek treatment with their own struggles, he told me that it wasn't always easy because of the stigma around it, and it being seen as a sign of weakness, and also not being fully aware of how important it was. We touch a little bit on the more recent news with the Olympic athletes coming forward with their mental health struggles, specifically Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka. And he said, it's important for athletes to recognize what's going on with them and how it impacts them. Oftentimes, there are many athletes from a variety of sports going through similar situations, but they aren't always talked about or brought up. It's important for people to know about mental health, but more specifically in the sports world, because it is something that affects everyone. I asked him a little bit more about his program and how it's helped athletes, and he explained that we all have this great ability to focus, but oftentimes it's on the wrong things. So what he does is try to help athletes on their focus drive and help refocus themselves. Another technique we spoke about, and this pertains to anyone struggling with mental health, is recognizing what triggers you, what sets you off in your anxiety or makes you feel overwhelmed, and using that to help to find a way to control it. He used the analogy of catching the rabbit before it goes far down the hole. But the most important thing he'd hope conversations such as this one would do is help people realize that we can assume what others are going through, but no one really knows but that person. And being able to be open and honest and allowing yourself to get help and work with people who can understand you and offer you that extra support is important. It is a team effort after all. I know, Nieya, you were able to speak to someone a little bit more familiar with what it's like for players on the field.
Yes, I had the pleasure of speaking with senior basketball player of North Park University, Jalen Boyd. He shared his thoughts about mental health and how to keep it in the forefront. Jalen Boyd started off playing baseball and football first, and then basketball came later. Jalen's definition of mental health is having a clean state of mind. He says, physically, sports is draining, but a lot of people say that 80% of the game is mental. Mental health is a very big and important piece of being a great athlete. You will be fine by training your mental health, being mentally free, and open to things. Jalen also says his coach does a good job of checking in on each of his players. He sends us a text about once every week. Jalen says checking in to see how we're doing outside of basketball is really nice, and that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Basketball issues and personal issues are definitely separate. Jalen says trying to keep my personal issues off the floor, I might end up using them as a motivation to go harder. I try to keep my personal issues as personal issues unless it's just too overwhelming. Then I will have to let my coaches and the staff know about certain things if I can't just deal with it the best that I can. Some of his techniques include listening to music, watching a lot of YouTube videos, and just trying to do things that aren't basketball related to take his mind off of certain aspects of the game. The advice Jalen would give is just to take a step back. For anyone out there dealing with any type of a mental illness, a lot of people preach there's no days off, but you actually need days off. It's a part of getting your mental and physical right. If you need to take a week off, a couple of days off, I think that's best because if you don't, it will definitely get overwhelming. And once it gets overwhelming, it continues to build up. And then you won't be the same player. You start to overthink things, and that isn't good. Jalen also says, realize what's important and do what makes you happy outside of sports. And some of his hobbies are him being really big on family. So whenever he has time, he goes back home to his support system, his mom, sister, and grandparents. He can rely on them for anything. Also, he does like to play video games a lot. That's a big stress reliever for him. And also, hanging out with his friends that he grew up with, it really helps pass the time to get his mind off of some of the most difficult times that he's going through. Mental health is common in most households, but it's hidden in most families. Jalen expresses at times he could have been depressed, but he doesn't think it was for a long period of time, maybe just a couple of days. Also, he doesn't think any mental illnesses have had longevity in his household or have been common, which is a really good thing. Now, when it comes to professional sports, such as the NBA, back in 2012, player Royce White, that was drafted by the Houston Rockets, addressed the lack of mental health policies. The NBA didn't really have a solid mental health policy in place. Royce White was able to share his story and he got the help that he needed. With him continuing to put this policy in place, he did receive some backlash at first, and the NBA believed players would use this as an excuse to not practice or play in a game. But White expressed you can't fake a mental illness. And so later, this prompted DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Love to speak up and become an advocate for mental health. This brought more awareness, and the NBA became more understanding. More players have since revealed their struggles, such as Keon Dooling, Ron Artest, now known as Metta World Peace, Trae Young, and Delonte West. Jalen says the league did a good job of supplying them with tools that they need, such as a sports psychologist. He thinks that when you look at these athletes who make millions of dollars always on TV, you sit there and say to yourself, well, they shouldn't have any problems. Jalen also says, I think more money, more problems. But being able to have been so comfortable to tell their stories and they just go through these different elements of life, at the end of the day, it just brings more realization that they are normal people. And Kevin Love started the Kevin Love Fund for mental wellness and physical health. This opened Jalen's eyes to want to work for something like this. It's pretty different from what he's used to. He said he worked in camps, but this is a bigger cause. And so he would love to be a part of something like this and be able to venture off into his own thing. My discussion with Jalen ended with a story about one of his close friends and teammates.
It was a teammate of mine back in, I think, high school. And we were pretty close. We grew up together playing. So, and, I think as boys becoming men, I think we're kind of taught to, bottle our emotions up and just deal with it. So when he, it's just a typical conversation, bro. I'm just not feeling it today. And it was just not surprising, but it was like I could relate because it's some days where I feel the same as well. And so when he did that, it kind of just showed that it's okay to just open up about it, no matter what it is. I mean, any little thing can be talked about as long as it helps. And then bottling it in, like I said earlier, it would only just, stress you out even more.
So now I will transition this over to Justin, who has some firsthand experience being on the field, and he can relate to Jalen Boyd.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to Jalen, but like not just as an athlete, as a male, and he mentioned it himself is that we're taught to bottle up emotions, and in a competitive environment, you're not supposed to feel too much unless we lose, so when we have depression and anxiety, these things aren't really talked about internally within the locker room or with a coach often, unless you just have a coach that is, empathetic in that way. So I definitely can understand and I feel his perspective and I empathize with it a lot because I experienced it myself when I played football. Like a lot of this stuff isn't talked about and isn't internally especially at a younger level, you know. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Ajani Olufemi, who's a Chicago Park District Councilor and has been for 16 years. And Ajani, he's from a different generation. He's much older than me. And so I felt it was necessary to really ask him how conversations surrounding mental health in sports evolved. And he feels that they haven't necessarily evolved, but they just been pushed more to the forefront. With, very recently with Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, and in years past, Brandon Marshall, when he talked about his struggles with bipolar disorder. And, Nieya, you named a lot of players like Delonte West and Trae Young, DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Love, NBA players who discuss these things as well. And a lot of our conversation was centered around mental health in youth sports because he is a youth coach and he counsels very young people, and athletes. And so we talked about just why isn't mental health talked about with very young athletes and young kids in general. And the big thing was just that people don't want to deal with the kids in the first place, let alone talk about mental health. And he talked about his experience as a teacher's assistant and how parents didn't even want to deal with their children that had special needs, and so he worked at length, with special ed students. And so he was able to identify struggling children and really meet them at their level, and try to help them. And the big thing we discussed too is the difference between how mental health in youth sports is addressed versus, at the collegiate level and the pro level. And the big difference were the resources. At the pro level, people have a lot more resources for them to be able to address these things and at times overcome them. And at the collegiate level, it isn't as widespread the resources, but they still have them at these high major colleges where they have millions on top of millions of dollars, to really invest in the athlete's mental health. And another thing discussed was just the lack of a serious and honest dialogue that was necessary to really aid, young athletes.
I'm glad you mentioned the lack of resources, Justin, because I believe in your interview with Jalen, Nieya, you mentioned that there not being enough resources available at his school, correct?
Yes, after doing my research on North Park University's website, in their athletic department, they don't have a sports psychologist. Instead, they have a director of student athlete support services. This is run by a lady named Annie Shane. And this is a really good resource to have, but it's not like having a sports psychologist. The main difference between the two is you go there to just get support on the issue that you have or something you're going through. And so you're just able to talk freely. Whereas with the sports psychologist, you're not getting that medical feedback or being able to get guidance and direction from a medical professional. So I think that's something that most schools, especially colleges, need to invest in because there are a lot of players who want to be able to go and play professionally, like, make it to the NBA. But if they're not, being able to have a dialogue with a sports psychologist, how are they going to really be able to go far and excel in their career? I know you, Elizabeth, have some similarities with this topic when it comes to Andrew Joy. Is there anything you would like to share about that?
Yes. In my interview with Mr. Joy, I asked what advice he would give someone who would be interested in pursuing sports psychology. And he said, you could read up all the books you want on it, but nothing would compare to having real life experiences and understanding the athletes and the environment and the pressure that they go through. Mr. Joy, being an athlete himself, was able to take his tools and create a successful company because he could relate to his clients. And as you both know, our goal in having this be our first topic was not only to bring awareness to mental health, but more specifically, mental health in the sports world. Life in itself is very challenging, and we all have our own struggles. And being able to see athletes that we idolize relate to us is very refreshing. And in another way, it's a way for fans to connect to their favorite players.
There were some personal struggles as well that I can relate to when it comes to not only the interview I had with Jalen, but also Justin. I did play sports growing up. I started off in gymnastics and soccer, but really I enjoyed basketball the most. That was and still is my favorite sport. And it was really hard for me to continue playing once I even made it to high school because it was just always someone in my ear telling me, oh, it's always just a lot of backlash that you get if you don't live up to the hype or the expectations that not only the coach and the staff have for you, but fans in general. And ultimately, I found that it just wasn't meant for me to continue playing. I didn't want to put myself in a toxic or negative environment to get all this pressure on me because sports should be fun. Obviously, it's serious, but it still shouldn't make it where it puts your mental health at risk because you're too worried about what the next person is saying about you or what they think about you. And that also leads to judgments, and we shouldn't judge one another. We have to uplift one another and help each other through those tough and difficult times because it's hard enough as it is if you lose a game, but to sit there and then have to listen to people talk about the fact that, you guys didn't win and something could have went better rather than just giving some moral support is also why there are tough coaches. They always put the team's needs aside and just only want to talk about winning the game and how we could have done a better job if we would have listened. So as you get older, it's something that you really think about and you realize that at the end of the day, you know your mind and what you can handle, which is the most important part of your body. Without your mind, you really don't have anything. And you don't have to be really diagnosed by a professional in order to know that you aren't feeling like yourself or you're not feeling your best. It's nothing wrong with sometimes self-diagnosing yourself, depending on how severe or deep the situation is. You should still definitely seek some medical help or attention if need be, but just definitely taking a step away from whatever it is that you're struggling with to pinpoint the problem is what's best. And like Jalen and his friend discussed, you just may not be feeling it that day. Everybody has bad days. And I've had certain situations where people who I really didn't know that well felt comfortable enough to share their story because it's always good to be able to go to someone and just have a listening ear. They don't have to be your friend, but sometimes that other person doesn't know who else they can go to, or they just have no one at all. And it's best to let people know that you have more of a open mindset and it's not all about just working. And don't overdo it. Justin, are there any takeaways that you would like to share as well?
You talk about the pressure and expectation that playing the sport can really, that impact it can have on you. Like it can really take your joy and love for a game away, and you love something like that and it's taken away from you and the joy of it is taken away from you, can have tolls on you mentally for sure. And you talk about sometimes you just have to self-diagnose and really recognize things yourself. That's a part of like that serious and honest dialogue that me and Ajani discussed, where you really just have to self-reflect and just be like, this is more than me just being sad. I might be depressed, like just so you can take something head on before it becomes chronic, and then so you can really understand how to like navigate it and combat it. So that's very important. And then with Elizabeth's interview with Dr. Andrew Joy, where he talks about identifying those triggers where you can really, so you can really like get in front of something before it gets bad. You know, when you really know when you're going to have a bad day or a bad week, so you can really know how to combat it and, you know, fight against it, or just limit the negative impact it can have on you. So those are my key takeaways from you guys' interviews.
One thing I will say that I liked in both of your interviews was the awareness for more resources, starting from the youth and college level. It would be very beneficial for both of them to have that additional support and have someone who can relate to them. Like you and, Nieya were mentioning before, it's okay to have off days. And that's certainly something I learned along the way. It's okay to not always have your stuff together. And I think the more we normalize it, the better it'll be.
What Mr. Andrew Joy had to say when it came to him being an athlete and now him being on the professional side of it, because now you get to actually see how it was for you, but now you're helping that person. Justin, with your interview with Ajani, him being around these young kids who just really want to enjoy themselves and be able to have like an after school activity, just to see their friends, that's something that they should be able to enjoy. Being so young, you shouldn't have to worry about being stressed out or worried about other people, making fun of you. They're too young to worry about having the weight of the world on their shoulders. And I think it's also important for parents to make sure that they're staying in their child's life and seeing who their coaches are and making sure that they are having a good time in whatever sport that they're playing.
Well, thank you, Nieya and Justin, and everyone for listening. And remember that mental health is just as important as physical health, and that you aren't alone. There are people going through the same struggles. I'm Elizabeth.
I'm Nieya.
No, I'm Justin.
Signing off. Thank you, guys.